I'm Richard Kinch of the Racine Coalition for Peace and Justice. This event is sponsored by the Racine Coalition for Peace and Justice and the Social Justice Committee of Olympia Brown Church. We are grateful to the people of Olympia Brown for the use of this excellent space. As you know, this is not the first time. Our guest this evening has been the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign since 2015. The campaign is a nonpartisan organization that monitors the health of democracy in our state, especially as regards the role of money in politics and attempts to manipulate and distort the franchise. Before joining the campaign, Matt Rothschild was for many years associated with The Progressive, the Madison-based monthly journal of opinion founded by Robert La Follette Sr. in 1909. Mr. Rothschild was editor and publisher of The Progressive for several years. His opinion pieces have appeared widely. He can often be heard on radio, and he has been a guest commentator on numerous television programs, including The O'Reilly Factor. Mr. Rothschild has been the guest of the Racine Coalition for Peace and Justice in the past, beginning way back in December 2003, when he spoke of the new McCarthyism of the Bush administration. Later in Racine, he spoke of impeaching President Bush, and more recently, about the assault on democracy in Wisconsin. These topics, and especially his subject this evening, not to mention appearing on The O'Reilly Factor, suggest that despite his courtesy and gentle manner, he is fearless. Finally, you should know that this evening's speaker is a birdwatcher and hopes this spring to identify the rare and elusive Kirtland's warbler. Please welcome Matthew Rothschild.
Thank you, Dick. I've never seen a Kirtland's warbler. Maybe I will. That would be nice. I'd like to thank Wayne Johnson for inviting me down this evening and helping to arrange the event. It's always great to be with members of the Racine Coalition for Peace and Justice and for other folks here in the greater Racine area. I am honored that State Senator Bob Wirtz is here. I've seen this senator in action and I've admired him from afar, so it's great. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Discussing the topic of Israel, Palestine, anti-Semitism, and U.S. policy is a good way to lose friends. But I'm going to give it a whirl anyway. Let me just start by saying I'm a Jewish American. My dad fought against the Nazis in Europe. I've raised our 3 children Jewish. The boys got bar mitzvah. Catherine got bas mitzvah, Temple Bethel in Madison. Let me also start by saying I've actually encountered anti-Semitism here in Wisconsin. In fact, in my first week in Madison in January of 1983 at the Crystal Corner Bar in Madison during the halftime show of the Super Bowl, the man sitting at the bar stool next to me all of a sudden said, "You know, Adolf Hitler had some good ideas." In the years that followed, I've heard several people use the expression "Jew him down." I guess it's a house and garden variety anti-Semitism. Actually, a Sauk County board member in 2011 said at a Sauk County board meeting, in a kind of braggy way that we had Jewed down the contractor. And then the county supervisor took weeks and weeks to apologize. At first he refused to do so, saying it's just a figure of speech. And since my last name happens to be Rothschild, I've been told on more than one occasion that my family rules the world. And let me assure you that that's just simply not true. Like all of you, I'm sure I was absolutely disgusted and appalled at the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, where people were carrying Nazi flags, people were carrying Confederate flags, and people were chanting, "Jews won't replace us." So it was beyond disgraceful for the President of the United States to claim that there were good people on both sides. It was nauseating, and frankly, it was scary. So I'm not deaf to anti-Semitism, not by a long shot. And when I heard Representative Ilhan Omar tweet that the support for Israel in Congress was all about the Benjamins, it actually did strike me as being over the line, because it echoed the stereotypical equation of Jews with money and undue influence. And when she said at an event at a bookstore in Washington shortly thereafter that she wanted to address the political influence in this country that says it's okay to push for allegiance to a foreign country, that struck me as even further over the line, because it echoed the old anti-Semitic canard that Jews have dual loyalty and are not to be trusted as citizens of their home countries. She was roundly criticized for these comments, rightfully so by some who have a decent history of fighting anti-Semitism and other bigotries, and very hypocritically by others, such as Donald Trump and Republicans who refused to denounce Donald Trump's Charlottesville comments, or Republicans who repeatedly peddle the name and the alleged influence of George Soros, which is nothing but a loud dog whistle to anti-Semites everywhere. It also needs saying that many Republican legislators have expressed even greater bigotry against Muslims and Muslim Americans than Ilhan Omar did against Jews. But leaving Ilhan Omar aside, some basic points need to be stressed. First, we need to be aware of anti-Semitism and to denounce anti-Semitism when we see it. We need to recognize that there's a rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and worldwide. Actually, there was a front page story in a Polish newspaper that said, "This is how you identify a Jew," and had all the old stereotypes. Probably curly hair and a big nose, too. So we need to recognize this. And we also need to recognize that ascendant white nationalists in this country and elsewhere have Jews in their bullseyes, along with blacks, along with Arabs, along with Muslims, along with Hindus, along with immigrants from Latin America. To the white nationalists, we are all inferior. Secondly, we need to denounce every form of bigotry when we see it, and anti-Muslim bigotry is certainly on the rise here and everywhere, as it's been given a huge boost by the board in the White House. You need look no further than the horrific mass murder in New Zealand to see the poison fruit of all the anti-Muslim hatred aloft in the world today. Third, and this cuts to the essence of tonight's discussion, we have a right as human beings to criticize AIPAC. We have every right to criticize the policies of the State of Israel. We have every right to criticize U.S. support for those policies without being accused of being anti-Semitic. No lobby is beyond reproach. No country is beyond reproach. And to call anyone who criticizes Israel or the policies of the State of Israel as being either anti-Semitic or, as I've been called before, a self-hating Jew, is to leave a null set of people who can criticize the State of Israel or the policies of the State of Israel. And that's just ridiculous. That's absurd. So how do we go about this criticism if we feel we ought to make it? First, let me suggest that it's wise to be careful in our use of language. And I'm an old editor, so I'm always trying to be careful in my use of rhetoric and language. Not all Jews in America support AIPAC or the policies of the State of Israel. So I don't like it when I see AIPAC referred to as the Jewish lobby. There is no monolithic Jewish lobby. AIPAC is a lobby for some Jewish Americans, those who feel strongly that Israel should be defended essentially no matter what its policies are. There are other groupings of Jewish Americans, like those in a group called J Street, or those in a group called If Not Now, that a couple of my nephews are part of, who don't support the occupation and don't support Israeli policies toward Palestinians. So we shouldn't paint with broad strokes. And yes, AIPAC is an influential lobby, but why is it influential? It's not just because of the Benjamins. It's also because its members are highly activated and will vote on this single issue alone. They are single issue voters. They let their voices be heard too. They're not quiet. They make a pain in the ass of themselves to legislators. They drive legislators nuts by berating legislators on this issue constantly, and sometimes it's just not worth it to legislators to deal with that. And so they don't take what I consider a courageous stand on this issue. I don't blame AIPAC members for doing what they're doing. That's their right. But in this regard, AIPAC actually is not much different than other highly engaged grassroots membership groups that lobby, like the NRA. Second, by all means, we have the right, indeed, the moral obligation to criticize the state of Israel for its ongoing oppression of the Palestinians. And in my opinion, we have a perfect right to support the boycott, divestiture, and sanctions movement, BDS. Here's Amnesty International's latest report on Israel. It's been 50 years since Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories and the start of the 11th year of its illegal blockade of the Gaza Strip, subjecting approximately 2 million inhabitants to collective punishment and a growing humanitarian crisis. The Israeli authorities intensified expansion of settlements and related infrastructure across the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and severely restricted the freedom of movement of Palestinians. Israeli forces unlawfully killed Palestinian civilians, including children, and unlawfully detained within Israel thousands of Palestinians from the occupied territories, holding hundreds in administrative detention without charge or trial. Torture and other ill treatment of detainees, including children, remained pervasive and was committed with impunity. The people of Gaza are living in an open-air prison. That blockade of Gaza has caused mass suffering, mass malnutrition, and death. And then there are the Israeli military assaults. Israeli soldiers were accused by UN human rights experts of committing war crimes last year in the killing of 189 Palestinian protesters, including some unarmed children. In 2014, Israel bombed Gaza for weeks, killing 2,251 Palestinians. According to a report by the National Lawyers Guild, tens of thousands of Palestinians also lost their homes. Israel targeted numerous schools, UN-sanctioned places of refuge, hospitals, ambulances, and mosques. Just this week, Israel is back bombing Gaza again. And today, as always, on the West Bank, Palestinians are separate and unequal. Israeli Jews travel on great roads while Palestinians aren't allowed to and face endless delays, hassles, and indignities, making daily life absolutely miserable. And now this week, Prime Minister Netanyahu has asserted the right to seize the Golan Heights permanently as part of Israel, an illegal claim that our president somehow endorses. And so over the last few years, an international movement has arisen to put pressure on the Israeli government to come to decent terms with the Palestinians. This is the BDS movement. You have every right to support it, as I said, without being called an anti-Semite. Such a movement caused South Africa to abandon apartheid, and I cut my teeth on the anti-apartheid movement in college, so I'm very sympathetic with these nonviolent movements to put pressure on governments who are engaging in repressive policies. And the hope is that the use of this nonviolent tactic will move Israel to make a decent deal. So I put it to you that as moral human beings, we have an obligation to oppose Israel's policies against the Palestinians, and as U.S. citizens, we have a further obligation. Since the United States gives $3.2 billion of military aid to Israel just about every year, making it second only to Afghanistan as the top recipient of U.S. military aid. So we as U.S. citizens are deeply implicated in Israel's unjust treatment of the Palestinians. Now I want to make two further points. First, we also have the moral obligation as U.S. citizens to criticize other U.S. allies that are engaging in atrocities and human rights abuses on a massive scale. Take Egypt. Egypt gets $1.3 billion in U.S. military aid. It's number 3 on the list. Afghanistan, Israel, Egypt. Amnesty International's report on Egypt states, Egypt's human rights crisis continued unabated. The authorities used torture and other ill treatment and enforced disappearance against hundreds of people, and dozens were extrajudicially executed with impunity. Arbitrary arrests and detentions followed by grossly unfair trials of government critics, peaceful protesters, journalists, and human rights defenders were routine. Then there's Saudi Arabia, the biggest purchaser of U.S. armaments. The House of Saud bought $18 billion of U.S. arms in 2017. And Trump claimed that after the sadistic murder of Khashoggi, that it would be foolish to break ties with Saudi Arabia and jeopardize the jobs that come from these arms deals. Never mind that Saudi Arabia has a terrible human rights record of its own. Never mind that it has been waging a horrific war against Yemen, threatening millions of people's lives right now. So just as we denounce Israel, we should denounce Egypt, and we should denounce Saudi Arabia. And if there are international nonviolent movements to pressure Egypt and Saudi Arabia, we should join those too. Sign me up. Here's my final point. We need to understand that Israel, like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, are outposts of the U.S. empire. That is the role they play. Israel is not wagging the dog here. Israel is on our leash. The United States supports Israel not because of the Benjamins and not because there's some international Jewish conspiracy that rules the world, which, let me be clear, there is not. No, the U.S. supports Israel. The Pentagon supports Israel because Israel is serviceable to the U.S. empire. Since 1948, Israel has been a reliable ally right in the middle of the strategic Middle East. Saudi Arabia has been a strategic ally since FDR called the king our son of a bitch. And Egypt, since Nasser, has also been a reliable ally. Just look at every U.S. intervention over the last 20 years. The 2 Iraq wars, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Yemen, the war in Libya. Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt all provided the United States with intelligence, with airspace, with refueling, with stationing of troops, with diplomatic support, and in Saudi Arabia's case, with protection of the vital resource, yes, oil, which the U.S. essentially claims as its own. Jimmy Carter made that explicit in the Carter Doctrine back in 1980. So we need to see the big picture here. And the big picture is that the U.S. is an empire. And an empire is incompatible with human rights. Empire is incompatible with democracy. We can't expect Israel to come to decent terms with the Palestinians. We can't expect the military dictatorship in Egypt to treat its people well. We can't expect the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to act responsibly, so long as we're an empire and we depend on them as our vassals. That's the bottom line. And the biggest moral obligation we have, along with bringing about nuclear disarmament and addressing global climate change, is to stop being an empire. The time to stop is now. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions if people have questions. Questions, anyone? Here we go. Marlene.
So Marlene Walker, interim minister here at Olympia Brown, and also a Jewish American. I'm with you until BDS, and then you lose me. I do not support BDS. I abhor the policies of Israel, but I think BDS can rightfully be referred to as anti-Semitic, as long as they're not challenging some of the rhetoric, like mountains to the sea, push them into the ocean, all that stuff. Until that changes, I cannot, in any good conscience, support BDS or organizations that support BDS. I just can't. So, and I appreciated your referring to, Egypt and Saudi Arabia. I would have liked to have heard something about Hamas and some of the atrocities that they've been involved in as well. So I think there's enough on both sides that my hope is that we can all come down and sit at the same table and have conversations, but I don't think we can have that with BDS in the middle of the room.
Do you have a question?
No, it was more of a comment.
Well, I appreciate the comment, and
What is BBS?
BDS is boycott, divestiture, and sanctions. This movement, international movement to pressure Israel to come to decent terms with Palestinians. And it's a movement that is controversial, and a lot of people aren't in favor of it for the reasons you expressed. And thanks for the invitation to come here and your hospitality here. And
Well, I think we have to have both sides of the
Right.
conversation.
And I enjoyed speaking with you this evening over dinner, and everyone was nice enough to feed me, so thank you for that. I do criticize any violent actions by Hamas, and recognize that, you know, sending rockets into people's homes is not a moral thing to do or the way to go. I do think Israel has a preponderance of military power there, and that there has been disproportionate punishment, collective punishment to the Palestinian people for the acts of the violent forces on the Palestinian side. But I don't think anyone who's for BDS is ipso facto or just anti-Semitic by the fact of being for boycott, divestiture, and sanctions. And to me, it's a nonviolent means to try to bring Israel back to the table. And I'm for nonviolent protest. And I think it's important to try to show Netanyahu and the right-wing government of Israel that they can't continue these policies with impunity. And I think this kind of nonviolent route, like in the South Africa apartheid case, can be effective. And I know there's some people in BDS who have this language about, you know, Palestinian territory from, you know, the Jordan River to the sea. I don't abide by that. It's not what I believe. I believe Israel has a right to exist. And I'm still a believer. It's kind of antiquated maybe now in the two-state solution, but actually the Israeli settlers, and many of them are American Jews, have rendered the two-state solution much more difficult because of all the illegal settlements that have been built on occupied territory. So, but I appreciate your position.
Any questions? Here's a hand over here.
Kurt Squire from Wind Point. My question to you is it because of a lack of apathy in this country, or is it the lack of media coverage? And people don't really know the facts of what's going on in the Middle East and the Palestinians and the Israelis?
I don't think it's apathy. I think there's a lot of ignorance. It's not a story that's covered very often or in a very two-sided way lots of times. It helps to have Palestinian friends, I think, to get a real appreciation from the Palestinian perspective. And I've been fortunate to have George Shalaby of Sauk City as a good friend of mine for many years. And he's Palestinian, grew up in Haifa. His home in Haifa was taken in 1948. And just talking with George over the years has helped me appreciate that. I mean, if you don't know Palestinians and encounter Palestinians, it's hard, or read the Palestinian viewpoint, it's hard to sympathize with what's going on, just because you don't get the information. And it was like during the Iran-Contra war, my mom, who was a consumer, pretty educated consumer of the media, said, you know, those Nicaraguans are terrible, aren't they? And, you know, shouldn't we go overthrow the Nicaraguans? Because that's all she heard. So I don't think it's so much as ignorance as a lack of information and a lack of personal sympathy that comes from knowing people. And, you know, Edward Said was someone who I read and then had the pleasure of interviewing at the Progressive. Edward Said, the great American and Palestinian intellectual who wrote about Orientalism and was an advocate of Palestinian rights for many years, now dead from leukemia. But I would recommend his books too.
No, I saw a special on Gaza. And the conditions. I saw a 2-hour special on Gaza. It was very in-depth, and the conditions are deplorable. I mean, you walk down the streets, there's nothing but bombed out buildings. People are scared to meet. They're afraid, and also the corrupt government of Hamas. These people, I don't know what the solution is, but they're in bad shape. It's terrible.
Yeah, I would recommend, Democracy Now! Is a news outlet. Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! You can hear a Palestinian perspective on there that you don't get in most places in the United States. It is important to get other sources of information.
Carl Lasseter. I'm looking at this map of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I looked at 1947 to 2005. It looked like Israel had basically co-opted or taken over practically all the Palestinian territory that was supposed to have been theirs. How does the United States and AIPAC rationalize this? And the second thing is, are you familiar with the Bolin Act?
The Bolin Amendment?
Yeah.
I remember it from Central America days.
Okay, because if we give weapons or whatever military supplies to countries, they shouldn't be using them to attack another country. And I'm looking at what we're doing in Yemen and also what we're doing to the Palestinians. They're using American-made weapons to attack these people. Should we cut back on aid or what?
I do believe we should cut back on aid to all three countries that I mentioned, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. You mentioned how the occupation was justified. I asked about that. Well, Netanyahu himself said this week, to the victor goes the spoils, essentially. That we took the Golan Heights because it was a defensive war, and in defensive wars, if you capture their land, you get to keep it. That's not how international law reads, but that's how we in Trump are interpreting it these days.
Diane Lang, thank you. I love the way that you, every time you come, you go deeper on different subjects that I'm ignorant in, and I would say current situation of linking Egypt and Saudi Arabia with Israel, other than very superficial understanding, it's an area of weakness, so thank you for that. And I appreciate your commitment to nonviolence as a way to solve it. I'm just wondering if you can say from your point of view, for small communities, the most important things for us to do to continue to build relationships and to develop our base of understanding so we can then take action.
Well, thanks for your kind comments, Diane. I think first hearing the Palestinian viewpoint from Palestinians is something that I would suggest. I'm sure there are Palestinians in the community here and in the greater Milwaukee area for sure. Richard Abdu, who used to head up We Energies, a businessman, I believe he's Arab American. He criticized one of the two Iraq wars, I can't remember which, and then just got lambasted for doing so as violating his shareholders' interests or something. By the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel on their editorial page and on right-wing radio, of course. But, and I don't know, is he still around or whether he's active or whether he identifies with this issue or not? But there must be Palestinian Americans in the area that you can meet with. And I'm all for dialogue, and that's why I appreciate your comment. And I think it's important to have dialogue with the rabbis in the area, Rabbi Feingold, for instance. I wanted to meet her today. I'm sorry she's not here. I know she was invited. I know her brother and one of her sisters. Been a big Russ Feingold fan, so. And I hear she's amazing. So I just think it's important to hear all sides and communicate across divides. And we don't do that enough in this country on any issue. And increasingly, we're doing less and less. I'm angry that the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel got rid of its op-ed page and commentary page, and it doesn't let a lot of voices in anymore. I'm angry that Wisconsin Public Radio dropped its Friday weekend review shows from 8 to 9 that I was fortunate to be on every 9th or 10th a week when there's a debate between a progressive and a conservative. We need public spaces where people can have civil dialogue, not shouting matches, but civil dialogue and discuss things and see where our differences lie and see where maybe we can understand each other a little better and listen to the other side. I was talking to Kathy Kramer, who wrote the Politics of Resentment, the UW professor in Madison, because I had to give a talk yesterday at Conservation Voters, the League of Conservation Voters at a lobby day, and they wanted me to talk about, how do you persuade people who don't agree with you already, which I guess is redundant. And so I called up Kathy Kramer to get her advice, because she's been working this field of how do we communicate in Wisconsin with people across the divide. And the first 5 words that she said was, listen, 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 listen. That we need to listen to the other people on the other side and try to hear where they're coming from and have some empathy for their position, and then try to make a human connection first on some level before getting into the political arm wrestling.
When I saw this advertised in the paper, it said anti-Semitism, and we talked about other topics. And I'm another Jewish individual. I actually belong to Rabbi Feingold's congregation. And I abhor Netanyahu. On the other hand, obviously, if you're an educated Jew, you're torn. I'm torn. I'm pulled this way, I'm pulled that way, and I hate to say this, but I was raised in Racine, my father grew up in Racine, so it makes anti-Semitism takes it to a whole new level if you grow up in a community where there are not Jewish people. It's like you're a secret society. And there are several rules. 1, there's nobody who's going to take care of the Jews except the Jews. 2, everything in the world is divided into two categories. Good for the Jews, bad for the Jews. And obviously, there are no easy answers here, but when one says anything about anti-Semitism, then you get hit with another one of those wonderful characterizations, or, oh, you're just being overly sensitive. Another stereotype for Jews. We're also too smart, we have all the money in the world, we control the media, and we're overly sensitive. If you've been a victim of a Holocaust, do you think you might be a little overly sensitive?
I really appreciate those comments, and this feeling of being torn is a feeling that I have felt personally for a long time. I grew up in Highland Park, Illinois, a Jewish suburb with a minority Italian Catholic population, and a very affluent suburb, and I didn't encounter anti-Semitism there.
Yeah.
And then I went to Harvard University, I didn't encounter it there. Then I went to Washington, D.C., and didn't encounter it there. And so I came here and I was kind of taken aback. And my experience is not atypical. I was just reading an account in a Madison newspaper of a woman named Jenny Pressman, who is a daughter of Holocaust survivors, who has done a lot of great work on liberal causes in Madison, and she talked about first encountering the expression "Jewing down" in Madison, and having people ask her if she actually has horns. And my wife's family grew up in Janesville, and when I went to Janesville at the beginning, her relatives acted like, I was from Mars. Like they didn't know any Jews, really. I mean, her dad was a lawyer who actually worked with Feingold's father,
Right.
who was a lawyer in Janesville, and they were friends. But some of the other relatives on the other side, what do you do on Christmas? And, it's just, just crazy questions, and touching my curly hair, and, You know, it's just weird stuff. So, you know, you really struck a chord with me there. And those expressions I heard all my life growing up, you know, is it good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? That's the only issue. And that's why I was saying about AIPAC. A lot of Jewish Americans are single issue voters. That's the issue they vote on. That's the question they ask themselves. And politicians, when confronted with citizens who have strongly felt views on one single issue, and they express those views, sometimes they take note of them. So I think that's why I said that's one reason AIPAC is powerful. No one takes care of the Jews. You know, I just think we need to get, I mean, I know where that's coming from. After the Holocaust and 6 million Jews died, after a history, 5,800-year history of persecution and pogroms, you know, you can understand why that is a commonly held view of Jewish Americans. I think Jews probably all over the world, and Israeli Jews. And I want to get to the point in this world where we all take care of each other. And we're not there yet. And so that's why we get into this kind of, we got to protect our own and stand up for our own. And so I understand all that, but I don't think those two imperatives get us to an answer. And I don't, of the issue of the oppression of Palestinians. And I don't think the oppression of Palestinians is actually in the long-term interest of Israel. I don't think it's in the long-term interest of the United States, or the U.S. empire for that matter. I don't think, nor do I think it's in the long-term interest of Jews outside of Israel. And so all those things concern me too.
Any other? There's a hand over here.
I'll talk really long.
Use the mic, please.
Oh, okay, sorry.
We need to hear the good question.
Thank you. At the bargaining table, it seems as though Israel has the upper hand, upper hand. What bargaining points does Palestine have? What can they offer that Israel would want other than their land, I guess, and them out of there? But what can Palestine do to bargain and negotiate with Israel?
Well, you're right that the power balance is in Israel's favor, but I think Palestinians have made a mistake, and representatives of Palestinians have made a mistake in their rhetoric, using rhetoric that was either anti-Semitic sometimes or destructive of the existence of the state of Israel, and that doesn't get you to go. And so, you know, there was a hopeful time when Yasser Arafat came to the White House and the White House lawn, and there seemed to be a recognition of Israel's right to exist, Palestinians' right to exist, and that was a rare period. But I think the rhetoric needed to, sometimes there's fallback into bad rhetoric by Palestinian leaders, and that's not helpful on the Palestinian side. But I do think for them to gain more power on the imbalance, that's why the boycott, divestiture, sanctions movement is an effort to try to give the Palestinian side a little bit more power to get Israel to get to the bargaining table. The United States has a great deal of influence that it's not using, and the Obama administration tried in a kind of half-assed way to exercise a little bit of influence, but didn't do much and got flack for doing the little that it did.
Question that I'd like to raise, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, it just strikes me as one of the sad turning points. I was wondering what your observations about that might be.
Yeah, I mean, I look back at that period with Arafat at the White House, Mandela coming out of prison, and for a brief moment there in the mid-90s, it looked like, we're going to get a respite from the horror that is everyday news in America and in the world. And then, we had that assassination of Rabin by a right-wing Israeli, and then we had the assertion that there's no Palestinian partner to negotiate with because Arafat was being obstinate. And then when Arafat died, Israel still asserted that there was no one really to negotiate with. I thought it was bad news for Israel when Arafat died because they could no longer use that excuse, but they kept using it. You know, assassinations do make an impact on the direction of history, and we saw that in the 1960s here. I hate to be an instrumentalist, as the Marxists used to call people like me who weren't structuralists, but, you know, that does make a difference who's running a country and who's leading in the nonprofit or public square. Maybe not in an elected position, but yeah, I think that was a huge blow. No doubt it was a huge blow.
Any other questions? I see a hand over here.
She can go first.
Okay.
I don't know that all the people in the Unitarian Church and the other people who are non-Jews understand completely the law of return. Have you ever, has anybody heard of it? All of it? The law of return went into, do you want to speak to it?
No, go ahead.
Well, the law of return went into effect in 1948 when Israel became a state. And what that meant was that anybody who was a Jew, anybody in the entire world, was free to emigrate to Israel. And that's been going on now since 1948 at an increasing rate. There are Jews from Africa, there are Jews from Yemen, there are Jews from Syria, and the Jews that, the early settlers in Israel were the Eastern European socialists, and it was a different society, and your speaker knows about this, but I don't know that you do. And the people who are coming, the Jews who are coming from Africa and Yemen and a lot of these places, these are the people who brought Netanyahu to power because they are fundamentally very conservative, very old-fashioned, very whatever. So it's, but at the same time, it's like, where are you going to put all of these people that want to live in the homeland where they feel they can truly be Jewish? And just to tell you what a community Racine is, I was working in Racine County, when Yitzhak Rabin was killed. As a matter of fact, I was working for Racine County. I hope nobody tells anybody this story. But there was not one single solitary individual. And I was publicly, I proclaimed myself to be a Jew. So apart from being written up for talking about Holocaust, not during break one time, there was not one single solitary human being at that office or anybody I ran into at all who said, I'm really sorry about what happened to Yitzhak Rabin. Can you imagine what would happen if there had been a person of African American renown who had been assassinated and nobody said jack? But that was just another, nobody takes care of the Jews except the Jews. So I really want you to know that this is so complicated that this is, that, and I feel compelled to defend my position that because of circumstances over which I have no control, there are real needs for places to put people as well. And that doesn't mean there couldn't at some point be some accord, but when there's assassination, several Israeli children were just killed the other day. Well, I don't know how many years ago it was, the Arabs came over and they bombed that kindergarten, and all those kindergartners were killed at the kibbutz.
Would you like to ask a question?
Well, let me just...
I'm sorry.
No, that's all good.
I said, how can you,
Appreciate
the
it.
question is, how can you make that
Yeah,
right?
Well,
I appreciate the dialogue.
I mean, you can't, I mean, on the violence and the killings, you can't make, no one can make it right. But I do want to think that Things maybe in Racine have changed after the slaughter at the Pittsburgh Temple. Wasn't there something in Racine? In Madison, there was a huge gathering of 3,000 people at the Unitarian Church. And every faith leader in the community was there and spoke quite powerfully. And I do want to say, in an analogous situation, this horrific murder in New Zealand. And, my first impulse was to send an email to my Muslim friend Masood Akhtar, who has this group in Madison and now all over Wisconsin called United Against Hate. And I just think when things like that happen to Muslims, we need to reach out to our Muslim friends. When things like that happen to Jews, we need to reach out to our Jewish friends. And it does make us feel better if we're part of that community that has been assaulted. I know I felt better going to the Unitarian Church.
My name is Nancy Barter, and my husband died a couple years ago, but he was from Israel, a Jew from Israel. I happen to be Christian. We had a very good relationship with that. But his opinion and his knowledge was that we have a lot of relatives in Israel, that there are many, many people in Israel that want the Palestinians to have. I think they get confused. They don't know if they should have a state or someplace, but they have a right. Israel has, it's about almost 50% of Israel feel that the Palestinians require and need some place of their own. They don't know what's best. My husband always had the feeling, his children went back to Israel to live, that he says, I want my children and grandchildren to be able to live in peace. And so many do. So it's a lot of the world, not only us, that want to see peace.
Thank you, Nancy, for that. And I know there are a lot of Israelis who recognize that Palestinians have a right to their own state and certainly live in peace. I worry, as the other speaker did, that percentage may be going down in Israel, in part because of the composition, in part because the old socialists and kibbutzniks are fading, and in part because there have been a couple generations there who've grown up under very right-wing governments with a lot of right-wing propaganda, and that's troubling. And the peace movement in Israel, to my understanding, is not as strong as it used to be. So that's one regret that I have. But it certainly isn't true that all Israeli Jews feel one way about what's going on as far as Israel's actions vis-a-vis the Palestinians, not at all. In fact, you can read in Haaretz and some other Israeli newspapers, a lot more dissent than sometimes you can find here in the United States.
My name is Chris, and I really don't understand why genocide has happened to so many different people, and it's happening, to me, it's happening in the reverse here now in Israel. And when do people learn that they're doing that? I mean, it's like they don't even realize that it's happening again.
Well, I am worried about genocidal actions that occur wherever they occur, and mass slaughters like in Yemen. And, it's a strange thing. Martin Luther King has that quote, is my least favorite Martin Luther King quote, that the arc of history bends toward justice, because it's not an arc. It's like this. I mean, if you want to graph the thing. It doesn't really bend to justice. I mean, how do you graph the Holocaust? Or how do you graph Pol Pot? Or how do you graph, all the folks who died in China and the Soviet Union? How do you graph the genocide against the Armenians? And remember when Hitler was told about the Armenians, he said infamously, who remembers the Armenians? Or look at the Kurds, they've never gotten a decent state of their own. So, or look what's going on in Burma. I mean, there's just a lot of places in this world where human beings' capacity to commit all kinds of cruelty is on display. And that's really the lesson of the 20th century. And it's not a cheery lesson. But we need to, build empathy and build understanding and see the warning signs. I mean, I'm going around the state of Wisconsin over the last year giving a talk on the risk of fascism in the United States because of Trump and Trump's racism and Trump's ultranationalism. And those are kind of the calling cards of the fascists. And, it can happen here. That's the reality of it. And so I think we need to be, when he does his national emergency and does all the stuff that he does, and then talks about, like 2 weeks ago, well, I've got the military and I got the police and I got these motorcycle gangs on my side. Who do you have on yours, essentially? That should take our breath away. And so I worry about the direction of the country as a whole, and I worry about the lack of empathy for other peoples who are suffering. The old saying, one person gets killed is an atrocity, and when a million die, it's a statistic. And the other thing that comes to mind is Stalin's comment when he was told that the Pope doesn't like what he's doing to the Catholics. And Stalin said, how many divisions does the Pope have? And that is what I'm wondering about Trump. How many divisions does the House of Representatives have, or the Senate have, or the U.S. Supreme Court have? So we need to be attentive to all of these things, to genocides wherever they're occurring, and to risks of another Holocaust wherever that might happen, or really anti-democratic fascist intonations and formations like there are now in the United States with this burgeoning white supremacist movement. And Jews to the white supremacists, I said, Jews are not human beings, according to these white nationalists.
Diane Lang, I just wanted to share a couple of things. My introduction was pretty short before as the chair of the Social Justice Committee, but I wanted you to know just a few things, like this church, this faith, many of you are from this church, but others are guests, and we really deeply believe in the interconnection of beings and life and the way that we need to support each other. It's an essential principle. And some of the work that our committee has done has put us into good dialogue and working relationships with people from the African American community, the Muslim community, and also the Latino group. And from the immigrant justice work, we have met some new Jewish friends and worked with them on court accompaniment. And so some of you, your wives have gone to court because in order to speak up for the immigrant family. So I think what Matt is saying, that dialoguing, and thank you so much for the sharing that came out of people tonight, was really enriching. Building dialogue, continuing to stand for each other. I understand more tonight why the Jews who are a part of starting the NAACP, they get it. They have the history of getting it. And so we all can be better allies, we can all do more work together. Those of you that haven't followed the NAACP, they have some invigorating new leadership. I invite you to think about renewing your membership or getting it going for the first time. There's some exciting new leadership coming in that area as well. Elaine Kinch is here, and she has been following and watchdogging the Palestinian issue. So if you don't currently have a Palestinian friend, you have a very good ally. She'd be glad to talk to you more about that, so check in with her. Elaine, raise your hand in case someone doesn't know you. So I think we're going to take a few more comments from people. Let's go with, is there anyone else that hasn't had a chance? I think you raised your hand up.
By the way, my wife and I are joining the NAACP in Dane County.
All right.
We went to a meeting 3 weeks ago, a conversation, community conversation. It was wonderful, and the leader of the organization is great. And so one of their board members is one of our board members, and it felt very important to join. And so we're doing that.
Right, that's great.
I just want to make a statement more than a question. It seems like the state of Palestine made was in 1948 by opposing Israel, the state of Israel, militarily. This enabled Israel under the banner of defense to continue to expand the territory, so they've lost all the territory. So it seems that in retrospect, they should have gone along.
Well, what could they go along with? Their land was being taken from them. That was the problem.
They maintained the borders, the 1948 borders.
Well, I mean, what would you tell my friend George Shalaby, whose mom's house who got evicted from her house in Haifa? I mean, their land was taken in 1948. And, you know, it was a problem at birth that there was no arrangement made then. Well, I mean, that's a function of the problem of colonialism.
Okay, Marlene, you get one more chance here in the dialogue?
Well, actually, this time I have a question.
No question, okay.
So my question is, what's your take on the upcoming Israeli election?
I would be happy if Netanyahu doesn't win. I am rooting for Netanyahu to lose.
You think that's a real possibility?
You know, I'm a betting man, and I want to bet against him, but it's a possibility.
That's my prayer. And then one other comment, just to correct the quote.
The quote you attributed to Martin Luther King is actually by a Unitarian minister named Theodore Parker.
But he used it, did he not?
Yes, he used it for, yeah, he did.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so
But it originates, right.
I'm still not very fond of it. Anyway, thanks very much for hearing me out.
Thanks again for coming and participating in the dialogue. We also our guest speakers a memorial cup from the Racine Coalition for Peace and Justice.
I think
You
I
may
have
have one already.
Yeah, I'm getting a collection.
Thanks again.
Sure.